I can't stand the word empathy. I think empathy is a made up new age term and it does a lot of damage. Sympathy, I prefer more than empathy. Those are the words of the late Charlie Kirk, and my name is James, and I'm with the Ought Podcast. Today, I'd like to really kind of have a sympathy versus empathy discussion with you. I know this is going to be a polarizing subject. Anytime anybody brings up Charlie Kirk, it seems like defenses come up, shoulders rise, fists ball, and there's a lot of anger associated with the man. I would like us to put down our defenses and just have a moment to have a conversation about sympathy, empathy, and kind of like the rise of this notion of self destructive empathy that we're seeing kind of rise in the podcast space. I, as somebody who's trying to enter the podcast space or is running a podcast, I feel like I have a duty to have this kind of conversation, kind of get involved in this, uh, because I think that there can be harm. And I think there is some harm coming out of this that I'd like to try to nip in the bud as fast as possible, or at least lend my weight to it. So this is going to be my 2 cents. So basically, the structure is going to be I'm going to give some definitions of sympathy and empathy from Merriam and Cambridge dictionaries. And then I'm going to kind of have a conversation about immigration, and we're going to have a conversation about the LGBTQ community. And in both of these, I'm going to try to highlight times when I think, to steelman the sympathy, and there are going to be areas where I'm going to try to steelman the empathy. And I think that we can kind of see why I think, uh, why I think that there's so much resonation with this idea that empathy is bad and that we should be sympathetic. And I think we can have a conversation about where, at least my thoughts on where that's stemming from, why we think that sympathy, like for the people that are really trying to push sympathy is good, empathy is bad. I'd like to kind of put that out there, and I'd love to have responses and comments. If you're somebody who really gung ho, boo, empathy, yay, sympathy, I'd love to have a response from you. Hit me with it. I'm not trying to again, this is not an offensive attack video. It's really just a conversational piece. So again, let's lower our guards a little bit. Let's hear one another out, and let's just have a discussion about this. Okay, so definition of sympathy. I'm sorry, empathy. Empathy, the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another. The act of imagining one's ideas, feelings, or attitudes as fully inhabiting something observed, such as a work of art or natural occurrence. The imaginative projection of a subjective state into an object so that the object appears to be infused with it. The ability to share the ability to share someone else's feelings or experiences by imagining what it would be like to be in that person's situation. Sympathy is an expression of understanding and care for someone else's suffering, a feeling of expression of sincere concern for someone who is experiencing something difficult or painful. In the notes of Merriam-Webster, it says sympathy is a feeling of sincere concern for someone who is experiencing something difficult or painful. Empathy involves actively sharing in the person's emotional experience. Confusion about the pair of words likely stems from the fact that the word sympathy, which dates to the 16th century, at one time carried both of these meanings. When empathy was coined in the early 20th century, it was first applied in contexts of philosophy, aesthetics, and psychology, in which it still has technical use. The common use of empathy known today dates to the mid 20th century. So again, Charlie Kirk made a distinction between empathy and sympathy. Obviously, it can be taken out of context, and obviously, I'm just taking a small snip from something he was saying. And again, my goal is not to belittle the man or to praise the man. It's just to simply say that I am seeing a rise of this conversation, and I would like to participate. So again, his quoted is, "I can't stand the word empathy. I think empathy is a made-up new age term," which, side note, obviously, it is a newer term, but just because something is new doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. We had slavery in the 16th century. Slavery is bad. If you think it's good, we're not going to communicate well. But obviously, if you think slavery is bad, stay a while and listen. We can acknowledge that just because something is old doesn't necessarily mean good, right? So and additionally, I think sometimes having that split allows us to focus more on one aspect. If we were to keep it together, we get aspect of that sympathy terminology. But language is living, kind of like how 6'7" is now a thing. Kind of like some of the emoji chat speak that teenagers are using or were using. I know that when I was a younger man, I had my own little language that drove my, seniors crazy, I'm sure, and so on and so forth. It's because language is living. So this idea that, we have the word empathy emerging and, oh, it's bad because, we should focus on older words, I think is very conservative, but it's in a way nonsense. But either way, to finish the quote out, it does a lot of damage. Sympathy, I perform more than empathy. It's a separate topic for a different time, obviously, is what he was the full quote. But um, I think that we can acknowledge that sympathy can be damaging, but I think that, and there is probably some room there for us to have some, hey, we should not use sympathy to the point of ignoring our laws. So to Steelman example, let's go straight into immigration, right? So we are a nation of laws. We need immigration enforcement and border patrol for security reasons, which is a post 9/11 lesson. And obviously, there are some concerns out there that I think are valid when we think about maintaining a stable labor market, right? Just like if we were to flood a market with lumber, right, we could bankrupt the lumber manufacturers in an area because such an abundance of cheap lumber in the area, and you just drive out the competition, you bankrupt them because no one's buying their lumber anymore, and then you raise up prices, right? And we think, that's a bad thing, right? Obviously it's a bad thing for economics. So same thing with labor, right? If we flood the market with labor, all blue collar families are going to struggle a lot more because there's no incentive to pay them more or to value their labor because literally it's dime a dozen, right? So I think that we can have some discussion about labor market. And I think there's a lot of nuance when we talk about the labor market. But I think that on the whole, it is at least a reasonable idea to have that conversation. And you may say to yourself, "Well, you're ignorant. These immigrants fill these roles." Again, like I said, there's a lot of nuance, and to try to keep the video in a concise video. I'm going to say, I hear you, I understand it is a very nuanced conversation, but I'm asking you to just table those immediate responses and just acknowledge that on face value, it is a reasonable concern for someone to make, and we shouldn't let our claws come out and attack people who may be propagating this. We can definitely have a serious conversation about immigration and labor markets, but suffice to say, it is at least a reasonable contention, in my opinion. It's not an unreasonable claim to make, and I think there is some areas where one side is correct and like I said, it's a nuanced conversation. So to use sympathy, I am sympathetic to the pain and suffering that enforcing immigration laws cause. I can uh, uh, And what I mean by that is to say that um, I acknowledge that there could be a immigrant who comes to our nation legally, which that is typically what happens is somebody comes in on a work visa or a vacation visa. So we do already verify they're not terrorists, or they're at least not on some kind of watch list, and that they've entered the nation. So the immediate security concern has been rectified. They come in and then they overstay their visa is typically what happens. That's most of the time what's going on. Uh, they came here, let's be honest, like they knew what was happening. There's no confusion. Like they knew, hey, you're here for this many days, this many weeks, this many months, this many years. And then unless you get renewed, we're going to ask you to leave. You need to go. And then you ignore that, or you don't get renewed, or whatever happens. And, or you strive really hard, but the nation just says, we don't need you. We need you to go. And especially if you're here for a very long time, you may have started a family, with somebody who's legal, right? And then all of a sudden we've got this whole tearing families apart because the offender is being deported. And so we can say I am sympathetic to that situation, but I'm not going to override our laws and allow you to stay. Um, that's that critique of self-destructive empathy, because once we say no, 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 you can stay, I'm too sympathetic to your situation. Then how can we justify enforcing the law at all? It becomes a very slippery slope of just and we do need our law enforcement officers to perform their duties and not have to spend every moment in this topsy turvy maybe land. Like we need to have clear set rules and regulations. And so otherwise it's just the Wild West, and it's who knows, like it just all falls apart. So it makes sense, right? We could say, okay, obviously sympathy is required, not empathy. But we can also use empathy in these situations to prevent barbarism, right? So the moment we start to say, having a bunch of kids in these kind of dog cages and these an alligator Alcatraz flooding. This is maybe a bad thing. We don't have food for these people. This is a bad thing. We don't have clean drinking water. This is a bad thing. We're taking babies away from mothers, and we have no idea which mother this baby goes to. That's a bad thing, right? Empathy can prevent barbarism in these situations, right? So I think that that's when we need to say, no, no, no. Like we need to still hold them accountable, keep our laws, do the enforcement, but we need enough empathy to make sure that we're still not being monsters ourselves in the enforcement of this, right? It's kind of like saying, look, I get that, this is a contentious subject. I get that there are going to be people out there that are going to disagree with me and maybe very angrily disagree with me. And if I was in law enforcement, if I was in ICE, I should, be like, hey, I'm sympathetic to your protest. I'm sympathetic to your disagreement. But, this is the law. And if you don't like it, you need to change the law. Absolutely. I think that law enforcements need to have that mindset. It is incumbent then upon us citizens to exercise sympathy and empathy and look at our laws and decide, hey, is this a just law? Like if we only ever exercise sympathy, then we are unable to look at our laws and say, hey, you know what, these laws need to be changed. Yeah, that's kind of the great danger of sympathy, the great danger of only having sympathy and cutting out empathy and just throwing empathy away. That's the danger on the other side of the coin, right? Like when we talk about extremes, yes, extreme empathy can be bad, but at the same time, just extreme sympathy, which looks a lot like apathy, is also a very dangerous thing. And I think that's something we really need to think about, guys. It's like think about slave owners before we emancipated, our slaves and said, hey, we're not going to do slavery anymore. Empathy is what drove abolitionist movements. Sympathy, I'm sympathetic to the slaves. God, I feel bad for them. Like, yeah, but I'm not going to change our laws. We're a nation of laws. I'm not going to do it. Right. So we immediately can see just an obvious, clear cut, situation where, hey, sympathy is actually harming our society. We're not able to move to a better place because everybody's just sympathetic. Like, it sucks to be them. I can feel for them, but I'm not gonna do anything about it. Sympathy requires little to no action. Um, that's not entirely true. Like, I could be a doctor, right? And if somebody comes in with a crushed arm, and my doctor training, I go through a whatever's, and I say, okay, well, I got to cut the arm off to save your life. I'm sympathetic that you don't want to lose your arm. I'm sympathetic that the situation sucks, but I have to do the greater good, which is to save your life and cut your arm off, right? So that's a place where sympathy is best, but empathy would be like bedside manner, right? Like I'm standing over you and you've just lost your arm and just amputated it, and I'm just like, screw you, buddy. I had to save your life, and so I cut your arm off, and then I walk off whistling Dixie. Empathy is like, man, you've suffered this great tragedy, this is going to be rough. There's paths forward, but I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry that you were involved in that wreck, and I didn't cause it, but I can feel for you. I'm empathetic to your situation, and we're gonna get you involved with a rehab. We're gonna do this. We're gonna do that. We're gonna get you back on your feet. And yeah, you're gonna be armless, but we're gonna it's not the end of the world, and there is a path forward and there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So don't despair, friend. Right. I think that is an exercise of empathy over sympathy. Right. And then, we can be sympathetic in the immediacy of the act, and we can be empathetic at our bedside manner. So this is why I think that, it's a scale, guys. It's not, boo one, boo the other, or yay one, yay the other. Like we got to go back to that kind of centralist viewpoint where it's sometimes we need to be empathetic and sometimes we need to be sympathetic. And I think that when it comes to law and order, we should be more sympathetic. And when I say, I should say enforcing law and order, we should be sympathetic over empathetic. But when it comes to our very laws themselves, and looking at the justifications for those rules and regulations, maybe we need to be a little bit more empathetic and a little bit less sympathetic. And to combat some of the more authoritative spaces that are out there, when we think about um, Christian ethics and Christian morals and how we ought strive to be. Obviously, if you've been watching my content, I'm on the atheistic skeptic side. But that doesn't mean that I don't take these discussions seriously, and I don't take the Bible quite seriously, and I don't take the beliefs of my Christian friends and family quite seriously. I think that we can look at it and say, hey, my foundation is Christian ethics. And I'm not willing to compromise on my deeply held Christian faith. And so we need laws to reflect my Christian faith. And I'm going to be sympathetic to atheists. I'm going to be sympathetic to the non-Christian communities in my community, but I'm going to enforce my ideal Christian society upon these people. And if you don't like it, get out. Right. This is an exercise of kind of that Christian sympathy, and the issue is when we get, especially with LGBTQ plus, right? And it's not to say that there's plenty of Christians out there that are perfectly fine with LGBTQ plus. I'm really kind of referring to the Christian nationalists that really believe that these people are the great moral evil in our society. They convince themselves that grooming is a real thing. And just for those, just to put it on the record, grooming is nothing more than identity politics. That is, there's no research to back it up. There's nothing you can point to and say, aha, here, see, grooming is how homosexuality comes to exist. Grooming is literally a identity politic way for a specific Christian group to convince themselves that homosexuality is still a choice, that these people are choosing to sin, and it's not something that just is part of who they are. And so it's a way to maintain that view system. There are people out there that think that it should be treated like pedophilia, and I've seen those debates where, it's saying, oh, well, you're born homosexual. Well, so are pedophiles. So, and I'm like, well, when we talk about harm, we can kind of very quickly realize that the Venn diagram has little to no overlap in that regard. Let's kind of reel it back in before we start trying to say homosexuals and pedophilia. And grooming is just trying to, like I said, it's just identity politics. There's no research to back that up. So in those cases, I think sympathy is the weak one. I think that when we think about LGBTQ plus, especially with our trans community, we need to really exercise empathy in those fields. I'm not saying with empathy, imagine, what it must feel like to be a woman inside a man's body. I'll just be honest with you, I can't do it. Not because I'm like morally against it, but simply because I can't even imagine what that's like. So I'm very sympathetic to that experience because it's like, I don't know, I've never felt that way, and I don't even know how to feel that way or to even try to see the world through that lens. It's just beyond me. It's like just acknowledging that, I don't know what it's like to be in my wife's head, to see the world through the lens of being a female. I just, there's maybe some areas that, I can accept, from my wife, but I personally just, I haven't experienced it. Like, imagine menopause, imagine, the period as a guy. Like, could you honestly say what that experience is like, or even have a clue as to what that experience is like? No idea whatsoever. I'm just like, I'm sympathetic to my wife's period. I'm like, yeah, it sucks. I don't know what to tell you. That's exercise of sympathy. Empathy is like, I know she's struggling, so I'm going to go to the store and get her pads, or I'm going to, get the heating pad out, or I'm going to say, hey, is there anything I can do to help you? Because my empathy is saying, do something, right? So again, I think that I think it's all about a balance, guys. It's all about that kind of centralist view. Sometimes you're going to be sympathetic, sometimes you're going to be empathetic, but let's not boo one, boo the other, or yay one and yay the other. I think we can just be common sense about some of this. And I think that, like I said, with the LGBTQ plus, if we were to just say, okay, give me a secular humanist argument as to what makes LGBTQ plus bad, and if you're going to bring up children and essays and grooming, I need to see some evidence. I need to see some peer-reviewed scientific papers. I need to see something in that regard to be convinced of that. I'm not going to just say, oh, it's common sense, because it's not common sense. I don't see how it's common sense. If you're saying it's common sense, that's your identity politics speaking. That's not because there's anything common sense about it. Again, this is getting pushing back on some of these notions that are out there that are, I think, plaguing our society. I think that we can I'm sympathetic to you wanting to have that be true. I'm not empathetic, right? So there we go. We're again having that kind of discussion, that middle, that kind of center, that centralist viewpoint. So I think that this is something that we really need to have more comments and more discussion about as a society, to really understand like why we use empathy when we use the word empathy, why we use the word sympathy when we use the word sympathy. And I think there's great danger to boo or yay overly much on either term. I think that there's a time for sympathy and there's a time for empathy. A classic example: go walk down any card aisle and look at the word sympathy. Where does it appear? There was a death in the family. I can't empathize with somebody who's dead. I can't, but I can sympathize. I can say, hey, I can't undo it. I didn't cause it. I'm sad that you're going through a death in the family. Here's a card just to let you know I'm thinking about you. Maybe give you a hug. Just say, hey, I'm there for you when you need it. Yeah, sympathy, right? But I think that like your best friend's kid, was involved in a car accident, and empathy would be like, what do you need? You got tons of medical bills. I can bring you food while you're at the hospital. I'll see if I can pick up some work hours at the shop. Maybe start a GoFundMe and let me be empathetic to your situation. Maybe we can talk about laws about how our healthcare system is failing us and insurance, and maybe we can get some of that stuff going to try to be a more empathetic society in those situations, right? So I think the great challenge is sympathy is, I'm doing something or I'm not doing something, but I'm not going to allow. I'm going to stick with my hard oughts, my hard uh, um, boundaries. I'm not going to cross them. That's sympathy. Empathy is, I'm going to jump over the fence and try to have a meeting of the minds. Let me try to see these things through your lens. And I think a lot of times that gets to the justice of our legal system. I'm empathetic. Let me see what the law looks like from your eyes. Does my laws need to be changed? This is a good thing. This is how we defeated slavery, right? That's how we got past it, is just by having those moments. So again, I just wanted to put those 2 cents out there, get some discussion going on sympathy versus empathy. Um, I don't think I have anything past that. So guys, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.